Rancher found blood on his doorstep until the Bigfoot left a baby. There he thought it was just another cold morning until he opened the door. Blood, not much, just enough to freeze his breath. And then a sound, soft, fragile. At his feet lay a bundle, moss-wrapped, trembling, a baby, not human, not beast, something in between, and in the woods, just beyond the fog. A pair of eyes, watching, waiting. He could have turned away, could have walked back inside and locked the world out. But instead he lit the fire, laid down the rifle, and let the child sleep. They say monsters leave scars, but this one left a gift. And the man who once buried his heart beneath silence now held something too wild and too innocent to lose again. Not fear, not revenge, but a beginning. Before we begin, take a moment to comment the name of your city. Where are you watching from tonight? And when the story ends, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Montana, winter of 1894. The wind had teeth that night, sharp and endless, crawling through every crack of Elias Monroe's old wooden house. The ranch stood alone in the middle of the plains, no neighbors, no lights for miles, only the sound of the wind dragging across the frozen ground. Elias had lived there for years, ever since the fire that took his wife and son. What once was a home had turned into a shelter of silence. Every night, he sat by the fading fire, listening to the wood crackle, pretending it was a heartbeat that wasn't his. That night, the silence broke. 3 knocks slow, heavy, deliberate. He froze. The storm outside raged, yet the sound had weight, like a hand striking wood with purpose. He reached for his lantern, opened the door, and stopped. A long smear of blood glistened across the porch, fresh under the pale moonlight. No footprints, no rider, just wind and that smell of cold iron. Then, a sound, small, fragile, a cry. He followed it down to the edge of the steps, and there, wrapped in moss and fur, was a child, tiny, shivering, breathing. Elias's chest tightened. For the first time in years, something reached through the frost inside him, and when he looked up, he saw it, a massive shadow retreating into the trees. A choice stood before him: close the door, or step forward. He stepped. In the child's hand was a piece of bark carved with a small, perfect handprint, and as the door closed behind him, the storm howled, but the fire burned warm once more. Part 1. The child in the firelight. The wind clawed against the cabin walls, a restless rhythm that had long become the soundtrack of Elias Monroe's nights. He shut the door behind him and leaned his back against it, his breath heavy, his heart refusing to settle. The child, no. The small creature lay in his arms, limp, drenched, trembling. He didn't think. His body moved before his mind caught up. He crossed the wooden floor, knelt by the hearth, and placed the bundle near the fading fire. The last embers glowed faintly, a dying heartbeat in a room of shadows. Elias reached for the poker, stirred the ashes, and fed new logs into the pit. Sparks rose like fireflies, painting his weathered face in orange light. "Easy now," he muttered, not sure if he was speaking to the child or to himself. The creature made a weak sound, something between a sigh and a whimper. Elias frowned, searching through the trunk near the stove. A wool towel. A flask. Goat's milk from the morning. His hands shook as he poured water into a pot, setting it to warm. He hadn't cared for anyone in years. His body remembered faster than his heart allowed. He stripped away the moss and damp fur that clung to the small body. The creature's skin was soft beneath, pale but strange, with fine, dark hair on its arms. Its eyes opened slowly, two deep black pools, wide and alert. They didn't blink the way human eyes did. They just stared, watching him. Elias froze. The fire cracked, throwing shadows that moved like ghosts. For a moment, he felt the old fear rise, the same kind that made men load their rifles when stories turned to monsters in the woods. But this wasn't a monster. The child's breathing was shallow, uneven, fragile. Its small chest rose and fell in quick, uncertain rhythm. Elias took the towel, rubbed it gently along its arms and shoulders, drying the water, wiping away bits of pine and dirt. The creature flinched at first, then grew still. "There you go," he whispered. "You'll warm up soon." When the milk steamed lightly, he poured a small amount into a tin cup, dipped his finger, and let a drop fall between its lips. The child's mouth twitched, then opened, drinking slowly. The sound of swallowing filled the silence, a tiny, desperate sound that broke him more than he expected. He kept feeding it, drop by drop, until the cup was nearly empty. Then he leaned back, staring at the small life before him. The fire had grown strong again, its light touching every scar on his hands. And then those eyes met his, black and endless, reflecting the flame. For a moment, Elias saw something in them that froze his breath. Not wildness, not hunger, but fear. The same fear he'd felt the night he lost everything. He looked away, gripping his knees. "God, help me," he whispered. "What are you?" No answer. Only a faint sound, a soft coo, like a breath of wind. He sighed, turned, and reached for the shelf above the bed. There, folded neatly and untouched for 5 long winters, was a small wool blanket. His wife had made it for their daughter, Clara, before the fire took them both. He had never washed the smell of smoke from it. Some nights, he pressed it to his face, just to remember that warmth had once lived here. Now, his fingers trembled as he unfolded it. He wrapped the creature in it carefully, folding the edges close, tucking it under the chin like he used to do for his child. The fabric absorbed the damp, holding the heat close. The creature shifted slightly, curling its fingers around his thumb tight, insistent, alive. Elias froze again. That touch so small, so real, cut through every wall he'd built. His throat burned. The firelight caught the lines around his eyes, the salt of old grief mixing with the steam rising from the hearth. He sat there for a long time, watching the child sleep. The storm outside wailed against the roof, snow piling against the windows. But the cabin was warm now, too warm. For years, Elias had lived without sound, but the wind, tonight, there was breathing, fragile, rhythmic, and alive. He poured himself a shot of whiskey, the first in months, and sat back in his chair. His eyes wandered to the small figure bundled in Clara's blanket. He thought of the forest, of the massive shadow he'd seen moving between the trees. The image refused to fade the height. The stillness, the deliberate retreat. It could have taken the child back, but it didn't. It left it on his porch. Why him? He rubbed his palms together, feeling the dry cracks of skin. Maybe the creature knew. Maybe it saw in him what he didn't want to see anymore. A man who'd once known how to care. The log popped, sending a spray of sparks. Elias stared into the flame until his eyes blurred. Every creak of the wood, every sigh of the wind felt softer now. The rage and loneliness that had built over years began to slip, melted by the simple weight of a sleeping child. Outside, the storm began to ease. Snow fell slower, like feathers drifting through the night. He leaned forward, adjusted the blanket one more time, and whispered into the quiet. "You're safe here, little one. I promise." The creature stirred, its hand still clinging to his. Elias didn't pull away. For the first time in 5 winters, he didn't dread the dawn. He sat there through the night, half guard, half father again, watching as the glow of firelight danced over the walls and painted something he hadn't seen in years, hope. And when the first pale streak of morning reached the window, Elias realized the strangest truth of all. He was no longer alone. Part 2. Mark of the Beast, Heart of a Man. 2 nights passed before the storm finally broke. The air hung still and white, the snow frozen into a glassy crust that crunched under Elias Monroe's boots. The land was quiet, too quiet. Even the wind had gone still, as if the valley were holding its breath. Elias stood behind the barn, splitting logs under the thin silver light of the moon. The child slept inside, bundled in Clara's blanket, its strange, rhythmic breathing filling the cabin. Each swing of the axe echoed across the hollow. Then he heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the night. Heavy, slow, the weight of something enormous moving beyond the tree line. He straightened, listening. No horse, no wagon, no call of a man, only that steady rhythm thud. Drag. Breath. Elias set down the axe and reached for the rifle propped by the door. His fingers were steady, but his heart wasn't. For a long moment, he saw nothing, only the pale drift of mist above the snow. Then a shape began to form at the edge of the woods. It was standing upright. At first, he thought it might be a man. But no man stood that tall. The figure was huge, easily 8 feet. Shoulders broad as the barn door, covered in thick dark hair that shimmered faintly under the moonlight. It did not move closer. It simply stood there, breathing clouds of mist into the cold. Elias raised the rifle, though his arms felt weak. The creature didn't flinch. It only watched. Then, slowly, deliberately, it bent down. In its massive hand, it held something small, wrapped in cloth. It placed it gently on the snow, straightened, and looked at him one last time. The silence between them was heavy, but not hostile. Then the creature turned and disappeared back into the forest. No growl, no sound of breaking branches, only stillness. Elias stayed frozen for a long moment before lowering the rifle. His breath fogged the air in front of him. He could still feel the weight of that gaze, ancient, steady, not of an animal, but of something that understood. He stepped forward, boots sinking into the snow, until he reached the spot where it had stood. There, resting on the ground, was a carved piece of wood. A small, flat slab, its surface marked with a familiar shape, a handprint, nearly identical to the one the child had held that first night. but this one was larger, roughly cut, the edges smoothed by calloused fingers. Elias knelt, brushing snow from its surface. His hands shook as he turned it in the moonlight. The lines were deep, precise, human-like. He looked toward the forest again, but the figure was gone. Only the whisper of wind moved through the trees. The truth settled over him slowly, like the snow that covered his boots. The child hadn't been abandoned. It had been entrusted. A shiver ran through him, not from cold, but from the weight of understanding. Whatever that creature was, it hadn't come to harm him. It had come to ask something of him. The cabin light glowed faintly behind him, a single window spilling warmth into the night. Through it, he could see the outline of the small bundle sleeping by the fire. He exhaled hard, the breath steaming from his mouth. His knees bent, and before he could stop himself, he sank to the ground, the rifle slipping from his grasp and landing softly beside him. His gloved hand pressed to the wooden carving. The grooves of the handprint fit beneath his palm perfectly, as though it had been made for this moment. For years, Elias had cursed the heavens, the earth, and every god that let him live after his family was gone. He'd stopped praying, stopped believing, stopped feeling. But tonight, kneeling in the snow under the cold eye of the moon, he whispered words that rose from somewhere he'd long forgotten. "I'll keep him safe." The sound came rough, a vow scraped from the ruins of his chest. The wind seemed to hear him. It stirred, curling softly around him like an answer. When he finally stood, the fear that had clung to him since that first night began to fade. In its place was something quieter. Not peace. Not yet. But purpose. He carried the wooden piece inside and set it above the hearth, next to the rifle. The carved handprint caught the firelight, glowing faintly as if alive. The child stirred in its sleep, letting out a soft sigh that sounded almost human. Elias knelt beside it, laying a rough hand against the small blanket, feeling the rise and fall beneath. "Your kin came back," he murmured. "They didn't forget you." The baby's fingers twitched, curling slightly as if to answer. Elias sat there until the fire burned low. Outside, the forest loomed silent but no longer hostile. The snow had stopped falling, and somewhere deep within the trees, a long, low hum rolled through the night. Not a growl, not a threat, but something that sounded like gratitude. He didn't understand it, but he didn't need to. He looked once more at the carved handprint, the mark of something wild and ancient, and he realized how strange the world could be. Monsters didn't always come to destroy. Sometimes they came to remind a man what it meant to be human. Part 3. Storm and Shadows. The storm rolled in before dusk, a wall of black clouds crawling over the mountains and swallowing what little light the valley had left. The air grew thick with electricity. The smell of snow and thunder pressed against the cabin like an invisible tide. Elias Monroe knew the land well enough to feel it in his bones before it hit. The horses had gone restless hours ago, stomping and snorting in the barn. Even the crows had vanished from the fence posts. He moved fast, shuttered the windows, barred the doors, fed the fire. The wind began to scream. Inside, the cabin flickered with orange light. The child stirred near the hearth, its small hands twitching, the same low, breathy sound rising from its throat whenever the thunder cracked too close. Elias knelt beside it, adjusting the blanket, whispering, "Easy now. It's just the sky talking. But the sky that night didn't just talk, it roared. Lightning split the darkness in two, painting the cabin walls white for a heartbeat before plunging them back into shadow. The roof groaned under the weight of snow. The fire sputtered, then caught again, sparks leaping like startled birds. The baby began to cry, not loud, not shrill, but deep, trembling, like something remembering pain. Elias's chest tightened. He picked it up, rocking it gently, the way he used to with Clara years ago. His voice came out rough, cracked from disuse. "Shh, you're safe now. Nobody's gonna hurt you here." The crying softened into hiccups. Elias sat in his chair, cradling the child close, listening to the wind batter the world outside. The fire popped, casting shadows that danced across the walls, wild shapes that almost looked alive. Then, through the howl of the storm, another sound slipped in faint, steady, out of place. A light. Not lightning, something else. A glow, flickering beyond the window. Elias's heart stumbled. He rose slowly, careful not to wake the child, and moved to the frosted glass. The reflection of his lantern blurred against the snow, but beyond it there it was again. Two moving points of light, bobbing closer. Lanterns. And behind them, voices. Human. He set the child down, wrapped in the blanket, and reached for his rifle. Moments later, a knock hammered at the door. Not like the one from that first night. This was harsh, quick, impatient. Elias hesitated, his pulse hammering. Then came the call. Anybody home? He recognized the voice, Tom Weaver, a trapper from the next town over. The man had come through before, selling pelts and stories that never quite added up. Elias unlatched the door and opened it a crack. Wind blasted through, carrying sleet and snow into the room. Two men stood outside, faces wrapped in scarves, lanterns held high. Weaver and another man, stockier, meaner, both soaked through. "Evenin', Monroe," Weaver shouted over the storm. "Heard something strange out this way. You seen tracks, big ones?" Elias narrowed his eyes. "Tracks." The other man stepped forward. "Don't play dumb. Something's been killing livestock near the ridge. Cows torn open. We're following a trail, big prints. Barefoot. Heavy as hell. You live closest. You must have seen something." Lightning flashed. For a heartbeat, the carved handprint above the hearth glowed in the firelight, a reminder, a warning. Elias kept his face still. "Ain't seen nothing but snow and wind," he said quietly. The men exchanged a look. "You sure about that?" Weaver asked. His lantern light fell across the floor, close to where the child slept behind the chair. Elias shifted his stance, blocking their view. "You're welcome to look around outside, but there's no monster here." The meaner man smirked. "Monster didn't say nothing about monsters." He spat into the snow. "But something out there ain't right. If you do see it, shoot it first and ask questions later." Elias's jaw tightened. "That's not how I was raised." The man chuckled. "That's why men like me live longer." The wind howled between them, rattling the door. Elias nodded once. "Best be moving on before the ridge floods. This valley keeps her dead when she's angry." Weaver glanced at the sky, uneasy. "He's right. Jed. Storm's turning worse. We'll check the south side tomorrow. Tomorrow, then, Jed growled, stepping back. Elias closed the door as the men turned away, their lanterns shrinking into the storm until they were gone. The thunder rolled again, long and low, like a growl from the earth itself. He leaned against the door, rifle still in hand, breath coming fast. The room smelled of smoke, wet wood, and fear. Behind him, the baby made a soft noise, not a cry this time, but a low hum, like a heartbeat echoing his own. Elias turned. The child was awake, its black eyes open, fixed on him. It reached out a small hand, brushing against his cheek. The touch was warm. He felt something crack open inside him, a dam he didn't know he still had. He sank to the floor beside the cradle, the rifle clattering away. His shoulders trembled, not from cold, but from the weight of what he'd done, what he'd chosen. He had lied. For the first time in years, he had taken a side. Not for men, not for law, but for something the world would never understand. He whispered to the fire, voice hoarse and low, "They'll come back, but I won't let them find you. Not ever." The flames flickered, shadows curling across his face like a vow. Outside, the storm howled louder, testing the strength of the cabin walls. But inside, a stillness took root, fragile, fierce, alive. The child's fingers rested against his beard, and Elias covered them gently with his rough, calloused hand. For the first time since the fire that took his family, he didn't feel like a man waiting to die. He felt like a man with something left to protect. And when the thunder finally faded into rain, the cabin stayed quiet, wrapped in the faint, steady rhythm of two breaths, one old, one new rising and falling beside the fire. Part 4. Return of the Giant. By the third night, the storm had changed its song. It no longer screamed across the valley, but whispered low, heavy, exhausted. Snow drifted down in slow spirals, soft as breath, and the world outside the cabin was painted in ghostly white. Inside, Elias Monroe sat by the fire, half awake, his hands cupped around a tin mug that had long gone cold. The child slept soundly by the hearth, wrapped in the faded wool blanket that once belonged to his daughter. The room glowed gold from the firelight, but beyond the window, darkness breathed. Elias stared into the flames. The memory of those hunters still lingered, their boots, their voices, the word monster echoing like thunder. He wondered if they were still out there in the hills, chasing shadows they'd never understand. He'd spent years running from ghosts, the ones of his own making. But now, the cabin was no longer a tomb. The air felt alive again. Every crackle of the fire, every soft sigh from the child reminded him of the simplest truth that life was still worth guarding. A sudden sound broke through his thoughts. 3 knocks. Slow. Heavy. Measured. The mug slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the floor. The child stirred but didn't cry. The knocks came again, not desperate, not violent, but deliberate. The same rhythm that had once announced the arrival of the impossible. Elias rose from the chair, muscles tight, heart pounding in his chest. The wind outside moaned softly, brushing snow from the eaves like a warning. He took a breath, grabbed the lantern, and walked toward the door. The third knock never came. He lifted the latch and pulled the door open. And there it stood, a shape vast enough to fill the doorway, taller than any man, shoulders broad as a wagon, fur glistening under the snow. The creature's breath rose in steady clouds. its chest marked with streaks of dark, frozen blood. One arm hung heavy at its side, wounded but steady. Its eyes, those deep, knowing eyes, found his. They weren't wild or furious. They were calm, ancient, tired. Elias didn't reach for the rifle. He couldn't. He only stood there, frozen in the threshold. The firelight flickering between them like a heartbeat shared by two worlds. The creature didn't move closer. It looked past him, into the cabin. Elias turned. The child had woken. It was watching from the hearth, sitting upright now, small hands gripping the edge of the blanket. The faintest sound escaped its lips, something between a sigh and a hum. Slowly, the giant lifted its hand and placed it on its own chest, where the wound was. Then it pointed toward the child. Elias's throat tightened. "You came for him," he whispered. The creature stepped forward just enough for the snowlight to fall fully across its face. For the first time, Elias saw more than shadow. The features were half human, half something older, a broad brow, eyes set deep with a sadness that spoke louder than words. It knelt slightly, an act that made Elias's breath catch. The ground shook softly beneath the weight. From around its neck, it lifted a piece of bark, smoothed and carved. It set it gently on the wooden floor between them. The firelight revealed the carving, two handprints overlapping, a small one beneath, and a larger one pressed over it. Elias felt the sting of tears before he even understood why. The creature extended its hand, enormous and scarred, and let its fingertips brush the center of its chest. Then, slowly, it reached forward and touched the same spot on Elias's coat, right over his heart. The pressure was light, careful, reverent. In that touch, there was no threat, only trust. Elias swallowed hard. His hand trembled as he lifted it, resting it over the creature's for a single moment. "He's safe," he said quietly. "I swear it." The creature's head tilted slightly, as though it understood. Then it drew its hand back and lowered its gaze, not in submission, but in gratitude. Snow blew past the doorway, swirling around them like drifting ash. The fire behind Elias crackled brighter, its light spilling out into the storm. The giant took one last look at the child. The little one reached out a hand, fingers spread, cooing softly, a sound that made the creature freeze mid-step. A deep rumble escaped its chest, low, mournful, almost melodic. A goodbye. Then, with a slow and deliberate motion, it turned away. Elias watched as it walked into the blizzard, its outline fading between the trees. Each step left a crater in the snow, until even those vanished under the falling flakes. The door creaked in the wind. Elias didn't move for a long time. The lantern flickered, throwing long shadows across the room, shadows that seemed to breathe with him. When he finally shut the door, the cabin felt too small for what had just passed through it. The world outside had shifted, and so had the one inside him. He turned toward the fire, lifting the bark carving from the floor. The two handprints, one large, one small, glowed amber in the light. He traced the lines with his thumb, the edges rough beneath his skin. The child watched him from the hearth, its dark eyes wide and curious. Elias sat down beside it, the carving resting in his lap. For a moment, he couldn't speak. His chest heaved, and then, as the storm outside softened into a whisper, he let the tears fall. They weren't the kind of tears that came from fear or grief. They were older born of something deeper, the kind that come when a man realizes the world still has mercy left in it. He reached for the child and drew it close. The warmth of the small body against his chest steadied him. "Your father came," he murmured. "He came to say thank you." The baby blinked up at him, its tiny hand resting over his heart right where the creature had touched moments before. The fire hissed softly. The wind hummed through the cracks of the cabin. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, Elias didn't feel like a man haunted by ghosts. He felt forgiven. And as he sat there in the golden glow, with the storm dying quietly outside, the handprints above the hearth seemed to shimmer in the flickering light, one small, one large, forever pressed together in a silent promise between the wild and the human heart. Part 5. The Handprint of Hope. Dawn came softly, as though the world itself was afraid to wake. The storm had passed, leaving the land wrapped in white silence. The forest stood still, its branches heavy with snow, and the air shimmered faintly with mist. The light that broke through the trees wasn't cold like before, it was warm, golden, almost forgiving. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned low, just embers now, soft red stars glowing in the hearth. Elias Monroe stirred from the chair where he had fallen asleep. The child was curled against his chest, breathing slow and steady. For a moment, Elias didn't move. He simply listened to the quiet, to the rhythm of life that had somehow returned to this lonely place. When he finally rose, the first thing he saw was the carving, the twin handprints of bark resting above the mantel, catching the new morning light. One large, one small. A symbol of two worlds that should never have touched, and yet had. He touched the wood lightly, his fingers tracing the grooves. The warmth of the fire had made it smooth overnight, and for a strange, impossible moment, he could almost feel a pulse beneath it, as though the forest itself was breathing with him. He smiled faintly. Then he stepped outside. The air was cold but gentle, the kind that bit your cheeks but carried the scent of pine and renewal. The snow on the porch glowed pink beneath the sunrise. Elias squinted toward the tree line, where the storm had swept the earth clean. That was where it had stood, the giant, the guardian, the mystery. Now, there was nothing but stillness, no shadow, no sound, just the faint whisper of the wind carrying through the pines. He stepped forward, his boots crunching against the frozen wood. There, on the porch rail, the old bark with the carved handprint lay where he had left it. The blood that once stained the boards was long gone, replaced by frost and light. Elias crouched down, his rough hands brushing snow from the carving. He turned it in his palm, and a smile ghosted across his lips, the kind of smile that comes from deep in the chest, not the mouth. Behind him, a small sound broke the silence, a soft, unsteady laugh. The child had crawled to the doorway, bundled in the oversized blanket, curious eyes shining with reflected dawn. It made a soft, cooing sound, then reached out, pressing its tiny hand against the wood beside his. Elias froze. The moment was so simple, so human, and yet it carried more weight than words ever could. The small handprint fit perfectly within the carved one, like it had always belonged there. Something broke loose in his chest. Not pain this time, but release. He felt his throat tighten as laughter escaped him. Quiet at first, then deeper, warmer. It was a sound he hadn't made in years, the sound of living. not surviving. "Well, now," he murmured. "Look at that." He glanced toward the forest again. The light was shifting, slipping through the branches in long, golden ribbons. The world felt new, reborn. He reached for his knife, the same one he used to mend fences, to carve names long since lost, and turned the bark gently in his hand. Beneath the overlapping prints, he began to carve a single word. The blade bit slowly into the wood, each stroke deliberate. Home. When it was done, he set it back in its place above the porch, right where the first handprint had been left weeks ago. The morning light touched the letters, making them gleam like gold. He stood there for a while, one hand resting on the post. Watching as the snow softened in the growing warmth, the child babbled beside him, fascinated by the glittering frost, tapping small fingers against the sunlight. "You see this?" Elias said softly. "This is where you belong now. Not out there in the cold. Not in the stories they tell." He turned toward the woods once more. The mist was thinning, and for a fleeting second, or maybe it was a trick of the light, he saw a shape between the trees. Tall, still, watching, his breath caught. The figure didn't move, but it didn't need to. The message was already clear. It was the same as that final look in the storm trust: gratitude and peace. Then, just as the sun climbed higher, the shape dissolved back into the trees, leaving nothing behind but silence and a faint shimmer of light where it had stood. Elias exhaled slowly. The fear he once carried, the grief that had hollowed him out, it no longer held its place. In its stead was something gentler: acceptance. He bent down, lifted the child, and held it high enough to catch the light on its face. The little one squinted, blinking at the brightness, then giggled a sound so pure it made the air itself feel lighter. "That's right," he whispered, smiling through tears. "The sun's up again." The sound of the forest shifted around them, not the roar of storms, not the echo of loneliness, but a living hum. Birds stirred in the branches. The creek in the distance began to murmur. The world was breathing again, and Elias felt, for the first time in a long time, that he was part of it. He stepped back into the cabin, setting the child down near the hearth. The carved bark now hung over the fire, its new word gleaming in the flicker of flame: home. As the day warmed, Elias sat by the window, watching light crawl across the snow, painting gold into the world. He thought of the creature, its wounded shoulder, its bowed head, and understood that every being, no matter how wild or strange, carried the same ache, the need to protect what it loved. He looked down at the child, now sleeping again, its tiny hand resting against his sleeve, and whispered, almost to himself, "Guess we're not so different after all." Outside, the forest shimmered under the sun. The marks of blood and fear were gone, replaced by a single symbol carved in bark and firelight, a handprint of hope, where two worlds had touched and found something worth saving. And as the wind passed gently through the valley, carrying with it the scent of pine and promise, Elias Monroe smiled, not as a man haunted by loss, but as one finally home. A year passed, the snows came and went, and the valley learned the rhythm of peace again. The cabin stood quiet beneath the morning mist, its roof now covered in soft moss and sunlight. Elias Monroe leaned against the porch rail, his hat tilted low, a slow smile warming his face. In the yard, the child no longer an infant, but a sturdy little walker chased after the old ranch dog near the fence line. Their laughter and barking carried through the crisp air, weaving life back into a place that once knew only silence. Elias turned toward the tree line. The mist there shimmered faintly, parting just enough to reveal 3 enormous footprints pressed deep into the soil. They led to the edge of the forest, and then, as always, vanished. He exhaled softly, touched the brim of his hat, and whispered, "Thank you for trusting me." The wind stirred, gentle as breath, rustling through the trees. The carved bark above the porch, the 2 handprints, and the word home swayed in the breeze, catching the sunlight until it glowed like a living flame. And in that quiet light, the forest seemed to breathe again, a reminder that kindness, once given, never truly disappears.